1929. A new young Spanish up-and-coming filmmaker called Luis Buñuel and a surrealist artist called Salvador Dali were sat together in a restaurant and both exchanged stories about dreams they'd recently had. Buñuel told Dali about a dream in which a cloud sliced the moon in half like a razor blade slicing through an eye. Dali responded that he had had a dream about a hand that was crawling with ants. Buñuel declared, "There's a film there, let's go and make it." And so they did. Dali and Buñuel proceeded to make a film which adhered to one simple rule: do not dwell on anything that requires rational explanations. Open the way to the irrational, regardless of meaning. The result was one of the most baffling and fascinating films in the early cinema era. A film that, within its 22-minute running time, is filled to the brim with body horror, psychological horror, and to this day, some of the most extreme images in cinema history. Join me as we continue our journey through the mind and body as we discuss the surrealist nightmare that is Chien Andalou. Welcome back to the Evolution of Horror. My name is Mike, and as ever, I am your host. If you're tuning in for the first time, then welcome. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre by looking at particular subgenres, one series at a time. This week, we're on to part 2 of our Mind and Body series, in which, as the intro suggested, we are going to be exploring that crazy, crazy film from 1929, Chien Andalou. We will be talking about this movie in depth, in spoilerific details, although I don't think you can really spoil a film like Chien Andalou. But I would recommend everyone go and check it out. It's only 20 minutes long, and you can actually just find it on YouTube. So have a little watch of it before listening to our discussion, or else our discussion will be even more meaningless than it would be otherwise. Not only that, this week we've got a very special treat for you. Later on in the episode, I'm going to be joined by my favourite Freudian cinephile, the brilliant Mary Wilde will be here, and we'll be chatting broadly about these incredible subgenres, psychological horror and body horror, and I'll be getting her unique Freudian perspective on the films and the filmmakers of this series. But let's get into all things Chien Andalou. Joining me to discuss this week's film is a brand new guest. She is a writer, a film critic, and a film historian. She's pretty much the expert when it comes to silent cinema. She runs Silent London. That's a place for people who love silent film. And while she is, in general, a little bit squeamish about the horror genre, she's got plenty of thoughts on Chien Andalou. It is my great pleasure to welcome to the podcast Pamela Hutchinson. Hello.
Hello. It's lovely to be here.
Oh, well, thank you so much. How is lockdown life for you?
It's eerily quiet, which is just appropriate for a horror podcast, I think.
Oh, perfect. Just tell us a little bit about yourself, first of all, who you are and what you do.
So I write about film for a living, like probably a lot of people that you talk to. My thing is that I'm a film historian as well as a critic, and my specialism, though I'm wary of saying that as we're about to talk about classic, my specialism is silent cinema. I have a website about silent cinema, and I kind of start early, shall we say.
That's very cool. What is it about silent cinema that sort of originally kind of captured your imagination?
I mean, there are various things. I remember when I was a teenager and I was getting into movies, and you go through all the lists of all the great films that you told you got to like and that are really exciting and important. And inevitably, you don't all like all of them the same way. And I knew there would be something out there for me that I'd want to find for myself.
Yeah.
Being a 17-year-old girl in the 90s, I wanted to explore cinema from hundreds of years ago. And so I began to realise that whenever you were thinking about silent cinema, when you were reading about it, there was a bit of mystery around it. We didn't know. It wasn't easily explained. And I liked that. I liked delving a little bit further back rather than just, I got a bit sick of the 1970s is what I'm saying. And, some of the greatest films came out then, but I just wanted to find something that offered a little bit more mystery. And silent cinema has provided plenty of mystery since.
It really has, hasn't it? And there must be something quite exciting about discovering some of these films sometimes, because some of them, it's like, it feels like they are, you know, there's always stories about them being lost and then, you know, found or sort of restored and all of that kind of thing. So there's something genuinely kind of historically exciting about this kind of era, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I always say, sorry to bore you with the thing I always say, but that I like silent cinema because, not because it's so old, but because it's so new. It's an experimental time when people are trying new things all the time. Yeah. Even in conventional mainstream cinema, you'll see strange experiments and people trying things that don't quite work or do work for the first time. And so I have that all the time. And then when you see something that you've been desperate to watch for years, that's been uncovered, you know, I feel like there are more surprises in old cinema sometimes than in new cinema. That's slightly exaggerated.
I love it. I know this is going to be a ridiculous question to ask you, but do you have a favourite film from this era, a favourite silent film? I know that's like saying what's your favourite film of the last 30 years or something, isn't it? But
is consistency allowed? I mean, you know, I remember years ago someone said, what's your favourite film? And I read a little article. So now I always have to say Sunrise. My favourite film, like everyone's, changes all the time. I would say that although the films of the 1920s are amazing, I have a soft spot for the early experiments. Anything from the 1890s and 1900s, there's nothing more exciting than a film that doesn't even know what it is yet. So, you know, favourite film, to me, it's kind of a favourite genre of film, really. You know, show me some sea landscapes and trains and I'm happy. I
know, we just, we talked on this podcast actually about Georges Méliès and, you know, the Manor of the Devil, is it? That one of those sort of really early ones that may or may not be kind of often considered the first horror movie, I suppose. But some of his work is absolutely just incredible, isn't it, really? It's like, you know, again, like you said, it's all of this stuff is so new and you're just like, how did people think to do this and make this stuff? It's absolutely incredible.
And with Méliès, it's not just that he thought to do it, but he immediately does it in such a beautiful way. I mean, those films are just like little jewel boxes. They're full of treats and they're funny and they can be almost quite scary and they tell stories. And you'll never get tired of going back to films like that. The joy of it and the beauty of it, especially if you see one of those colour tinted prints, then you're the happiest.
Absolutely. So we are, as you know, a horror podcast. Let me ask you, what's your sort of relationship and history with the horror genre? Are you a fan of horror?
I always contend that I'm not a horror fan. I'm not at all. And friends of mine, and some of my best friends are horror fans. They really are. And they contend that I am because I keep watching horror films. Although, you know, I wish I could remember this great quote from a friend of mine because I was saying, I'm too squeamish for horror and I don't like being scared. I don't watch horror films. And he pointed out to me that in that week I had seen, well, you can probably date this, I'd seen a really graphically gory, violent film, which I can't remember the name of, and The Others. And he said, well, if you've seen these two films, then you've seen horror. And I certainly remember loving The Others as a film. I am very squeamish when it comes to body horror. I'm that girl. And I don't think being scared is my favourite thing to happen when I'm at the cinema. I'd rather be moved or amused or see something that's beautiful. But, you know, great horror film, you can't beat it. And I do think they're really productive to talk about. I think it's really interesting to examine good horror films. And I would never try and describe any genre by its worst examples, you know. I have a lot of that with people think that all silent cinema is just rough slapstick or all musicals are just the really sort of cheesy, formulaic ones.
Yes.
So horror at its best is, unsettlingly good.
Exactly, absolutely. Yeah, you're so right about that. And it's so broad as well, really. You know, something like The Others is so completely different to something like Cannibal Holocaust or something like that. You know,
I have yet to catch up with Cannibal Holocaust. That's the kind of film that I'm missing out, I think, in my knowledge of the genre. But you know, I was trying to think what was the last horror film I watched, and I thought, it'll be something terrible that Mike won't be impressed with. And it's like, oh no, it was Dawn of the Dead. So I'm all right. Yeah.
Nice. That's great. Do you remember, like, do you have a kind of, a lot of people always have stories of kind of early memories of when they were young and they were traumatized by something, watching it too young or anything like that. Do you have any kind of early memories of your first experience of horror?
Well, I don't know if it's not a horror film, but obviously because I don't watch horror, never. But the first time I ever went to the cinema when I was very small was one of those occasions where I saw something that I was far too young for that was really upsetting to me. It was my big brother's birthday and we went to see Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom.
Oh, that's dark.
Yeah. I was horrified because, at first, dancing girls, and then it's a sort of adventure story, and then you suddenly see all this gore. And I think that I do get quite scared in the cinema, quite claustrophobic, which can be wonderful, especially if you feel a bit nervous and then you see a film that you really enjoy. You have this amazing rush of pleasure. But I think there's a little part of me that's still the sort of scared little girl that's worried what horror they're going to show me next. I do sometimes get very tense before going to see films that promise to have a little bit of violence in. And if I told you the name of films I have been scared to watch, you would be so embarrassed on my behalf. Like little white knuckles gripping onto the seat through a period drama. It's fine. It's fine. I don't trust films at all. And, this is a film that we're going to talk about that emphasised that for me, that films are not to be trusted.
Oh, totally. I know. And actually, if you want to talk about... I mean, I love that you've mentioned that you're really not good with sort of gore and body horror, because this film... it still really, really shocks me and kind of makes me go, blech, which is amazing. So let's talk about Chien Andalou. I usually start off the conversation by asking somebody to sort of give us a vague plot summary or plot synopsis. It feels like that's going to be quite a difficult thing to do with this film, but Pamela, as best you can, what is Chien Andalou about?
It's about sex and death and fear and class and religion. It's about cinema itself. It's about the fact that the bourgeoisie must be brought to its knees somehow, even if you are a member of said bourgeoisie. It's about the fact that cinema is dead, long live cinema. It's also a lot about insects. I mean, yes. And armpits.
And armpits as well, I know. I love it. What do you think of this film? What's your own sort of personal history with this film? Are you a fan of it?
I have to be a fan of it. It's like I guess it's a life-changing film. It's the first silent film I ever saw.
Oh, that's amazing.
I know, and also awful. And I think people think, that because I love silent cinema, I must have grown up, watching 16mm Charlie Chaplin films with my great-grandfather or something. Really cute story. Sometimes people ask for the story, and I was a teenager in a film studies classroom, A-level classroom. Shout out to Ealing Tertiary College, and the lecturer put this film on because it had a relation to a more contemporary filmmaker that we were watching. And I won't say who because we might discuss them later. And I was not ready for it, but I was very intrigued. I was horrified because the opening shot of this, the opening scene of this film, I still find difficult to watch. And I must have watched it, I mean, it'll be probably 100 times. I must have seen it so many times, that shot. And of course, I mean, I was quite a music-obsessed teenager, so I came out of the room quite horrified, but also realising that I could sing this film, that I already knew the song Debaser by the Pixies, that it was inspired by it. And so I was confused, and yet it felt familiar. We were meant to be watching it as an example of surrealism, and I just found that exciting in itself, but everything else about the way it was made just made me want to throw out all the Clint Eastwood films we were watching and so on for our course. No offence, Clint, and explore something more exciting.
Yeah, I pretty much have the same experience. I saw it at film studies. It must be like Film Studies 101, this film, mustn't it? I actually think it's got a lot to answer for, because I think a lot of, it kind of, it's like a much better version of millions of student films that you watch, isn't it? It's like, let's just be a bit crazy and surreal and film this. And, I think this film has a lot to answer for. But I loved it as well. And I think it's easy sometimes to dismiss a film as old as this as not being able to shock you maybe in the way that it did audiences at the time. But this film still is genuinely shocking. I think that eye moment, like you said, I'm the same as you. I find it really hard to watch. I think it must be something to do with the way it's edited and shot and the way it kind of defies your expectations, right? So for people who don't know, you've got this intro where you've got Louis Buñuel himself, who kind of looks like he should be a barber or a hairdresser or something, and he's kind of sharpening a razor blade. We see this woman sat in this chair. He stands behind her. He opens her eyelids, sort of pins them open with one hand, and comes towards the eye with the other with his razor blade. and we think we're not going to see what we're about to see. The camera cuts away and we suddenly are presented with this image, aren't we? This cloud. It's a moon. We see this moon, a full moon, and this very thin cloud passing over it, kind of dissecting it in half. So you think they're, they've done the kind of classic, they've shown you an alternative image to kind of suggest what we're about to see. So we see that cloud shot, but then we cut back to an eyeball actually being sliced open in all its gross, visceral, gory detail. And it's unexpected, it's frightening, it's disgusting, it's shocking, isn't it?
It's the unflinching close-up of the worst thing possible to watch, and also the fact that it's completely foreshadowed. I mean, it's absolutely classic horror filmmaking, I guess. Cloud crowing across the moon, which was the inspiration for it, the idea that looked like an eyeball being sliced, and then I couldn't believe it. You actually see the worst thing in the world to see. I think that eye trauma, what my friend calls ocular peril, is possibly the most disturbing thing you can see on film. I mean,
I agree.
Beyond, let's see several, things that are illegal. But yeah, and this is illegal too. But, even I'm trying to think of an instance of trauma to eyes that isn't traumatic in this way. We all read King Lear. Every time you hear the words "out, vile jelly," not only are they showing you someone, have their eyes taken out, and it often in medieval plays and things, it's got a symbolic value, which no doubt it has several symbolic values here, but it's the physicality of it, the vitreous goo, the humour that emerges, that spills out. And my lecturer, I don't know what your lecturer did, he didn't tell us until afterwards how it had been achieved.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And it's an animal, right? Is it a sheep or a cow or something? Is that right?
It's a calf, actually. I think for years and years, Benoit Andalou wouldn't say what it was. And then they did say it's a calf's eye with makeup, which in itself was quite grotesque, and then bleached and then shot with extra lights just so it looks as much like her skin as possible. Because obviously, so it's in situ.
Oh my God, it's so grim, isn't it? Let's talk a little bit about the backdrop of this film then. So, the surrealism and these two people behind it, Louis Buñuel and Salvador Dali, both kind of fairly sort of unknown at this point, right? Tell me a little bit, first of all, just for anyone who's maybe not heard of him, who is Louis Buñuel? What kind of films is Louis Buñuel known for?
Well, I'm not a massive expert on Louis Buñuel, but Spanish surrealist filmmaker, but who makes films that are not just surreal, because that suggests that they're sort of arty, but he's very socially motivated. There's a lot of attacks on religion and sexuality and sort of middle-class behaviour in his films. I mean, very famous films like Viridiana, Los Albadosos, or Belle de Jour, an incredibly shocking film. There's a certain aspect of everything in his film is laid out very precisely. He's one of those immaculate, meticulous filmmakers who plans everything, and his films often look like tableaus. Think of like the sort of peasant last summer in Viridiana, or things like the set pieces at dinner tables. And so he's the kind of guy who makes narrative films that have an artistic value in virtually every frame. That's not really what this is at all. And Dali, of course, we know as the great surrealist artist. And he went on, and lots of the images here recall some of his preoccupations, like hands and food and so forth, and sexuality. But yeah, this was their kind of calling card to join the surrealists.
Exactly. It was, like you said, his later films do have narratives. They do have stories. They are all a bit bonkers, but they do follow more conventional narratives. But I suppose this film, pairing him with the guy that does the melting clocks and everything else, I mean, this is what we get, I suppose. This is the result. So you've got this kind of this pairing of these two sort of sensibilities coming together. What was it that kind of inspired them to make this film? I mean, what was this film that they were trying to make? Or is it just a series of random images and scenes?
I mean, yes and yes. Both of your answers are correct, basically. So the idea was that, it's a reaction, not against mainstream cinema, but what was considered to be art cinema in France at the time. And these highly prestigious productions that have these serious narratives and films that you and I would probably love, like John Epstein or Abel Gance films, but that's not what they wanted. They wanted something that broke free of that, and so it would follow only dream logic. Nothing in this film has a rational explanation, and it would be rejected as an image in the film if it did. So the idea is that nothing makes sense. It may only be explained by psychoanalysis, Freudian logic, but it's just outside of logic. I think that obviously it's a very radical idea, but I would say that there's something else that's been going on in this sort of early film period up to this time, which is constantly people trying to find ways to say, what is a film? As in, what is a film if it isn't pretending to be theatre, or it isn't mimicking a novel, or it isn't mimicking painting? So what they're doing is basically here saying, and if you look at the title cards, it's really obvious, they're saying, what if a film was what a film is? A series of film images taped together, spliced together. So the time cards in this film, the intertitles we call them, which normally in a film can cover great periods of time and space and take you from one place to another and make everything smooth, they do the opposite. It's 8 years later, it's 3 years before, it's in spring, it's about 3 o'clock in the morning. None of the timestamps make sense. But of course, why would they? Because there's nothing natural about an intertitle. It's just an inserted piece of black film. So in a way, it is following this dream logic, but it's also getting right to the heart of what a film is and what a film can be and what is cinema, which is quite a big question to be asking.
Well, absolutely. And it wasn't it? I mean, I suppose in terms of this era of early cinema, I guess this is pretty late on, isn't it? So we had kind of established, hadn't we, the film rules, I suppose, the sort of basic continuity editing and kind of telling a narrative story. Filmmakers, I'm sure you know way more than me, but D.W. Griffiths and all those people, they had already kind of made all of those movies that we now think of as those kind of milestones, hadn't they? So I guess this was this kind of deliberately kind of playing with those conventions that were already established.
I mean, I think it seems to me that it so obviously is. You have scenes in this film that almost look like the scenes you'd have in any other kind of film. A man, a woman, a room, a chase scene, even like as in a comedy. But then it just doesn't work. There's one joke in there. I think we can call it a joke. Are we allowed to call it? That I really like. Often in a silent film, if a bell's about to ring or a clock is about to chime, you get a little insert cut away to the thing making the noise. Obviously there's nothing on the soundtrack, so you see the cockerel crowing, so you know that they're reacting to the rooster and it's morning or so forth. So here a door buzzer is hit, and instead of seeing a bell in the apartment go off, you see something that would sound a little bit like it, which is someone shaking a cocktail shaker.
I love that so much.
And it's a brilliant, and actually it's kind of beautiful moment, actually. And it's weird and bizarre because the cocktail's being shaken by two hands that have emerged from two holes in a wall. So no one would ever make a cocktail that way, not even Louis Buñuel, who was quite bizarre in the way he made cocktails. I love that. It is sort of saying, like, all you need to know is that there's a noise. So why don't we make the noise in a completely different way?
Yeah, exactly. I love all of that about it. And, they talked about, didn't they? I believe that this was kind of sort of based on dreams that both Dali and Buñuel had, right? And so it was kind of putting dreams and dream logic on screen. To the best of your knowledge, has anything like that sort of previously been done, or was this a kind of first of its kind in terms of surrealism and dreams and kind of, I suppose, sort of entering the mind via film?
I mean, hundreds of times, thousands of times. You have a film like G.W. Pabb's Secrets of a Soul, which is entirely about a man's like inner landscape, and it's visualized, and he sort of talked to Freud and things about that. You have dream sequences in films that are incredibly surreal. I mean, the surrealists themselves loved films like, for example, Buster Keaton and Sherlock Jr. And that scene where he jumps in and out of the TV screen. How old am I? Film screen. And he jumps from one scene to another, and it's editing that can do that. Real life can't do it. Dreams and editing can do that. And so there have been experiments with this. That is not to say that this film does not push it right to the limit. Absolutely to the limit. Every time you think you might have a handle on a meaning or a sense of progression, narrative would be too much. We get lost again, just like we do in a dream. And that's what they want. They want no rationalism. They don't want people, 90 years later talking on a podcast about what it all means. That's the last thing they want.
I know. If only they knew how much people would be, analysing this film to death. That is really interesting. And what do you think they're going for tonally? Because it is a film that makes me laugh quite a lot. Do you think that's deliberate? Were they deliberately kind of trying to tell jokes? Like you mentioned, there's a joke there. Are they trying to kind of put across that kind of playful nature and make us laugh, do you think?
I mean, it's really hard to tell, because I think that the the format of that dream logic can also be like the format of a joke quite often.
Yes.
The moment when you see the close-up of the man's hand with the ants in it, which is a kind of grotesque moment. And then there's a kind of formal match to the woman's underarm hair, shall we say. I won't say armpit again. Underarm hair. Now, ants in your hands is a French phrase, which means to get pins and needles, but also means to get a bit turned on. So there's an odd connection there. And then, just as you might be thinking, oh, maybe they're trying to make this kind of sexy connection, you know, that intimate part of the woman. And then suddenly we dissolve to like a sea urchin. We're kind of spiky on the outside and soft on the inside. And the whole connection is rendered quite absurd. And is that because that's what our brain does to our impulses? We raise them and then we explore them and then we dash them aside. Or maybe that's because that's how jokes work. The cocktail shaker's funny. The extreme images that you have here are funny. But really it's meant to be taken incredibly seriously. And they almost wanted people to riot in the cinema. They thought it was going to be like The Rite of Spring all over again. And they couldn't understand why people liked it so much. If you see the film they made next, L'Âge d'Or, then you definitely see a film that's much more clear about its targets, and that did anger people. But people got a lot of pleasure from Chien Andalou, even though it's meant to be kind of about death and horror.
It's amazing, isn't it? Because it is, obviously I'm talking about it in the context of a horror podcast, but it's also incredibly camp, isn't it? It's quite camp. There's a lot of like men dressed as women and people chasing each other around the room and grabbing boobs and grabbing bum. It's like this weird mix of body horror with, you know, Benny Hill or something at times.
This is it. I'm just about to walk out of the room. You're talking about silent cinema and someone mentioned Benny Hill. Right, I'm getting my coat and I'm storming out.
I'm so sorry. But
it's true, you know, there's an element of farce and slapstick. And but you know, really, if you're going to talk about sex, it is quite terrifying and it is quite absurd. You know, I mean, all our best jokes are about sex, right? So this is why it feels that way. And I think that actually some ways the humour of it breaks the tension, because if it didn't have that, it would just be looking at people who are scared, who are dying, who are suffering. I mean, you know, he's dressed as a nun and you find it quite funny, but also he seems quite traumatised by it.
Yes, that's true, yeah.
But it is funny to us. You see a man dressed as a nun on a bicycle, we expect a joke.
Exactly, that's it. It's the setup for a joke, isn't it? 100%. But then also there are these really creepy images. Obviously, the really famous shot of the eye, which we've talked about. Like you mentioned, the hand with the ants in it. There's a severed hand in a road. And the weird ending where they're sort of buried in sand. There are some weird images of bodies and body parts and that kind of thing. Would you in any way kind of consider this a horror film?
I mean, I don't, and I want to say yes because I'm nicely brought up. I want to say no, of course it's a horror film. I don't think it is. I mean, basically, what you don't have in 1929, in the 1920s, you don't have the horror genre. It hasn't been sort of formally identified. So this film, and there are films that obviously feel to us like they are precursors to the horror genre that are beginning to build up those tropes. Some of the sort of German emigre films, and even something like Cabinet of Dr. Caligari feels to us like it's playing with those rules. I think this isn't playing by any rules. I don't think you can put this into a genre, even one as broad and wonderful as horror. I think that it will horrify people. And I'm actually shocked, I tell you, how often I see that opening shot in montages and things, you know, just sort of greatest hits of cinema. Here's someone's eyeball sliced open. It's the most shocking image. And there are many, many films that have used that. And they're not all horror films, actually. I mean, I know there are lots of like eye-gouging horror films, but I was trying to think of films like Close Your Ears for spoilers, but, you know, Betty Blue or A Funeral Parade of Roses or all kinds of things. I watched an amazing Dario Argento film where the killer taped pins to the witness's eyes, so they had to watch. And even in that film, it was about the horror of watching is the trauma to the eye, rather than we're going to do something to the eye. A very, very difficult kind of thing to get my head around. I think it's almost too awful to go into most horror films.
Is there a connection there? This is, you know, getting into film studies A-level again, isn't it? But this idea that Louis Buñuel himself plays that guy with the razor blade at the beginning. So having this film director kicking off his film by cutting open somebody's eyeball, does that mean something? Does that mean that, what you're about to see is essentially him attacking your senses in some way? I think
you can't read it as anything other than a deliberate provocation of that manner. Yeah. Much as we're not meant to interpret it, perhaps. I don't think you can disregard that, partly because that image affects you on a sort of sub-rational level. It's actually visceral. I mean, literally visceral level. I mean, it turns your stomach as much as you sort of think, aha, he's attacked her eye and she is the spectator. She's looking back at us. She's returning our gaze and all these kind of things. And, the final image of the film, which you referred to, I mean, it's so awful. Talk about playing with conventions. In spring, the two lovers, but they're dead. Or they might be dead. God. They're buried up to their neck. That was meant to be an image of the two of them covered in flies like corpses, but they couldn't really achieve that. And so if you think about the idea that it was going to end with another gallingly horrific visceral image, rational explanations are not allowed, but that is a provocation to the audience and to cinema.
You're so right. And what was it about? I mean, you said he was going to have flies there. Obviously, there are a lot of insects and that kind of thing. What's the deal with the insects? You've got some dead donkeys, have you, in this as well? That kind of this idea of kind of decay and death, and then also bugs and things like that. I mean, is there a reason for any of that, in your opinion?
I mean, if I had a horror film expert to hand, I'd ask him why insects are so creepy. Because they're animals, but they're so unnatural, sort of delicate, and they scuttle or they flap. Yeah. You can probably tell me 18 great horror films about insects.
No, you're so right. They're always going to make you feel slightly uncomfortable and squirmy, aren't they, I suppose?
And, to see a close-up of a moth like you do, it makes you think of moths that are pinned down, and sort of everyone in this film gets sort of pinned down one way or another. The dead donkeys are probably my favourite bit.
Yeah, that amazing, the dead donkeys, and then it's also, there's 10 commandments on tablets that he's also dragging along, is that right?
So this is the point in the Pixies song, I always think, when he says, oh, you got me moving, girl, you're so groovy, and I can't help but laugh. It's a great moment, it's kind of funny, finally he's going to get to her, he's been chasing her. The preceding shots are very conventional, like she's scared, he's come to get her. And then suddenly he comes to get her, but he's dragged down by all these things. He's dragged down by the 10 Commandments, 2 priests, 2 grand pianos, and 2 dead donkeys. And I definitely remember when I first saw it going, oh no, 2 dead donkeys as well as everything else, as if that was the final straw that broke my tiny teenage mind. I think it's quite easy to put symbolism onto these things, that the pianos represent civilization and culture, and there's religion, and then there's the animal instincts that are lying dormant. He can't quite get to this woman. But it also is an incredibly powerful moment, and actually it seems quite an elaborate setup. There are a few shots here that are so simple, it's hard to imagine why they have such an effect. A simple superimposition or a shot of someone chasing around a room. But this is such an elaborate thing to concoct. You think that Dali could have made several paintings of it. And it's got almost too much symbolism in it. It inspires idiots like me to try and one of the priests is actually Dali himself, isn't he? To analyse it and come up with a reason why this is happening. I mean, it could be something to do with the fact that he's getting towards the girl, but also when you realise that it's dream logic, it could just be that we all feel like we're carrying morality around with this. Most of us don't find it a burden, though, of course.
I know. It's so fascinating. You're right. You almost want to watch this frame by frame and kind of figure out what's going on in every shot of this film. And you mentioned earlier, when you first saw this, your teacher was kind of talking, or your lecturer was kind of talking about this in the context of maybe other filmmakers or later works. Let's talk briefly about that. I mean, and again, it's a huge question, I suppose, but the legacy this film has left and the major influences that it's had on maybe any particular filmmakers or particular films, in your opinion.
I mean, I feel that there's a vast field of experimental cinema that's been inspired by this. Yeah. I think, if you see this film at an impressionable age, as you and I both did, and have our lives ruined forever, it does teach you that film is just images clipped together and you can put anything you want on there. And so I've thought of it in that context, and it's always interesting to remember, I think, that it was literally a handmade film. They couldn't afford the editing table, so it's literally pieced together by hand. We watched it in context of studying David Lynch.
Aha, yeah.
And of course, that's the big, I mean, and every time a film critic says dream logic, they're almost always talking about David Lynch. And what I think is quite exciting is when you think about the influence that it's had on him, you think of things like Eraserhead, wonderful, wonderful films, but you also realise that, people went to see Mulholland Drive and Lost Highway and Inland Empire in the cinemas, and those films make no sense. It's wonderful how, and Twin Peaks, of course, in Everyone's Front Room, he's brought that into the absolute mainstream. And there's something really wonderful, I think, about being able to enjoy a work of art. And this film is a work of art, and I'd argue that Lynch's work is too, that can't be simply explained away. You can't say, my least favourite kind of film criticism is the kind that says, what this film is basically saying is... Yes. It's reductive. There's polyvalence, poly and valence. There's two friends, and there's plurality, and there's ambiguity here, and it's wonderful. So anyone who's ever made you wonder, I think, about whether things are happening at the same time or before... that kind of idea of film as a loop of time, which you see so much in kind of art film as well and installation work. But Lynch would be my number one. But I don't know about you. How do you think it's influenced horror films?
Well, I was obviously going to say Lynch as well, and I think what's really obvious is that what's really interesting is that I'm kind of doing a whole series of chats about films that deal with specifically the mind and the body, which this film does kind of equally both, which is nice. But there are two filmmakers kind of emerged at the same time. One very much seems like he deals with the mind, the other with the body. So David Lynch and David Cronenberg.
Yes.
And I think there's definite there's Cronenbergian elements here as well. It feels like there's an influence there on his films, this idea of the kind of decay of the human body and disease and death and all of that kind of thing, and just our kind of that kind of those wince-inducing moments where you're sort of faced with the real horrors of the human body. I would say both of those, but like you say, there's a ton of it's I guess any dream sequence you've ever seen in a film, really.
But you see, the thing is, much as we say it defies explanation, it's got more value than just flashiness. A lot of people say, it's like a pop video, and I know, but David Bowie was very fond of this film and played it at some of his concerts and things like that, and obviously the Pixies liked it, but it's got more substance than that. And I think it's really interesting you say David Cronenberg, because the sort of permeability of the body, obviously they couldn't have bodies being devoured by flies, but there's that wonderful moment when the woman's underarm hair is projected onto his face.
Yes.
And the idea of interchangeability of body parts, and it looks a little bit like a beard.
It does.
It works. I mean, that is very Cronenberg. You feel, I've just, because I'm a terrible person who makes terrible choices, binged watched all of Rick and Morty during the pandemic, and it's all
absolutely.
about, they call them the Cronenberg creatures, don't they, every time? It's not a healthy thing to watch at this moment, I don't think. But, I love David Cronenberg's films. And I think that is another really powerful comparison. I didn't know whether you were going to slot this into mind or body horror, actually.
Yeah, well, it's a kind of, I'm merging the two, really, for this whole series. And this film kind of feels like it perfectly ticks both boxes. I initially went for it because of obviously the eye scene, and I thought, in some ways this has got some really early elements of body horror, and I kind of forgot until I rewatched it and read about it this week that of course the whole point of it as well is that it's so much about the mind and the subconscious and dream logic and everything else. So it was a perfect film to kick things off with, in a way. Next week we're talking about The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which feels like a good kind of journey into the mind and the sort of psychological horror, and Freaks, Todd Browning's Freaks as well, which I guess in a kind of slightly problematic way also could be considered body horror, an early body horror.
Yeah, body horror is to me like an unappealing term, as someone who screams.
Yes.
But, absolutely, this is what you have here. And it's interesting that, I said about, this period of film, they're trying to work out what films can be. And one of the things is, of course, that it's very easy to see silent cinema as cinema of the body, chases and stunts and things like that, but really the most successful silent films are the ones that use this format, this almost wordless format, to tell us what's going on inside people's brains. And that in minds, and that is really what marks out a great silent film from a less good one, because it's such a hard thing to do. No voiceovers, no conversations. And I think that if you watch this film seriously, I mean, I definitely recommend, watching it when you've had a few beers for a laugh, obviously. But if you watch this film seriously, and I think, it does deserve to be taken seriously, you could come away with some very disturbing thoughts about the way you live your life. There's a lot here about repression and subjugation, of desire and of freedom and things like that. There's a lot here that's really troubling. Apparently, in Freud, the hands are always a symbol of castration and so forth. So, I mean, it's not really been a problem for me, but it's a very serious and disturbing film about what goes on inside people's brains. And I wonder how many other filmmakers that you probably know much more about than I do this thing where they almost distract from this very disturbing internal horror, mind horror, as you say, with such a flagrant example of body horror.
Yeah, and that's the thing. And the two are, of course they are, the two are one and the same, really, as well. Most David Cronenberg films, even though they are body horror, they are also they're also psychological horror. And most of the time with David Lynch as well, you think Blue Velvet is all about a severed ear. Eraserhead is, of course, all about the body. And so I think that those two themes completely kind of interlink all the way throughout. Another weird thing that this film made me think of was The Silence of the Lambs, because of the moth.
Yes, of course. That's why I'm so terrified of, well, basically everything, but insects as well. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Also, you mentioned Eraserhead, and obviously, I mean, that film was absolutely terrifying and brilliant. Oh, God, I love it. Do I want to watch it again? Oh, I'm too scared.
Oh, it's so wonderful.
Yeah, it's a fantastic film. There's a moment in that film where someone rubs their eye, which has always terrified me. I don't know why. And maybe it's because I'd seen this film at that point. Maybe I hadn't. But, when I first saw that film. But I always think, like, just to see someone close up and to hear that noise that you normally only hear in your head. Is one. And I know that there's more disturbing images in that film. And I know there's a lot more going on. But we're not going to talk about that film. But yeah, it gets to the point where you see a knife near an eye, you see a finger near an eye, and you're just hiding behind the sofa.
I know. Well, I personally am much more squeamish about small, relatable things happening to the body than extreme gore and violence. So I hate in films little moments, thinking of more recent films like Black Swan or stuff like that, when like fingernails come off. Just little moments like that. Absolutely, I have to cover my eyes.
Well, in L'Âge d'Or that they made after this, of course, it was inspired by just as this was inspired by the cloud and the moon, they were going to have this Dali image of, I think it was a woman biting a man's fingernails off, or was it vice versa? And they decided it was too disturbing and too horrific. So in that film, there's a lot of like foot and hands in mouth and lots going on there. It's all very sexual. But yeah, they decided that was too disturbing.
Wow. Tell me a bit about, I haven't actually seen L'Âge d'Or yet, and this was the kind of unofficial sequel, is that right, to Un Chien Andalou?
I mean, sequel, again, it's like putting this film into a genre. It's not a franchise. Yes. We're not going into the Benoit Dali cinematic universe.
Imagine that universe.
Yeah, I would buy the extra because it's a much more obviously provocative film. It has images to do with sex and religion that are really quite shocking now, and there's a lot there that did upset people. So instead of, Chien Andalou, which didn't really seem to upset that many people and did quite well and got them sort of this membership to the Surrealist Club, L'Âge d'Or did actually lose them friends. And people said, you can't say that about religion. You can't show sort of images of a kind of Jesus figure having his toes sucked and things like that. It's very provocative film. And I mean, I have not seen it as many times as I have seen Un Chien Andalou. I don't want to sort of compare them, but I do enjoy the slightly more ambiguous and more sort of cinematic focus of Un Chien Andalou. I mean, I love that. I love the fact that this is a film in many ways about filminess, and that for me is something that sort of really excites me. It's hard for me to get into the mindset of two people in the early 30s in Europe who have a problem with the Catholic Church. It's not my particular, cross to bear, shall we say, offensively.
Nice.
And completely inadequately. But yeah, it's a different kettle of fish, and you can see what's going to happen with Benoit. That's what he's going to go into making films of. But, great image making in both films, as we say.
How important is the it's a funny thing to say about this silent cinema, but the music, the accompaniment that comes with films like this, because I watched it that had some very kind of upbeat, kind of playful French sounding music, and obviously I guess you can listen to different scores with depending on how you see a film like this. You could potentially watch it with no music, no accompaniment at all. Does that kind of affect your experience with these types of films?
Oh, completely. I mean, I think it's like an absolute privilege as someone who watches a lot of silent film that you get to see the same film with different music. So Buñuel did select a soundtrack for this film to be played off a gramophone. It's interesting to say that. So you could say that this is the music that should always be played, and it's a bit of Wagner and some tango. Interesting. Of course, the soundtrack isn't embedded in the film in the way that we would expect. Filmmakers at this point would never expect the music they chose or preferred to be the lasting music for that film. So that's his choice, but we shouldn't be tied into that. I suppose I slightly worry when films like this get often scored. That was a word for me, but they're quite regularly rescored, that sometimes because it hasn't got a narrative, or has it, and because it doesn't appear to have a narrative, I think that sometimes people use it as kind of groovy backdrop for their records rather than enjoying it for what it is. And I know that probably sounds like I'm being too serious, but it can be a problem. I mean, you do have musicians who play films behind them when they're at concerts, and it's quite odd. I mean, imagine if I went to their concert and read a book. Yes, it's so true, isn't it? It seems like a cool thing to do until you sort of turn it around. So yeah, I mean, the fact that a film like this has it's inspired at least one incredibly brilliant rock song. I mean, we're all fans, right? But it does inspire musicians to respond to it. I think it's a good thing. Obviously, it's a good thing, but I mean, it shows you how strong those images are. There are certain silent films that inspire more new soundtracks than others, and so this and Passion of Joan of Arc probably come up at the top. And purely because people see those images and are inspired to make music, and again, that shows what power these images have, because if it was a simple narrative, would you immediately want to translate it into another form of art?
Definitely. Absolutely. Finally then, I mean, I was going to ask you what the sort of reaction was to this film, and I know you mentioned it was quite kind of respected by other surrealists and that kind of thing. What about just kind of everyday audiences, moviegoers or the equivalent of that at the time? Were a lot of people able to go and see this film?
I mean, I think it played at one studio, one cinema in Paris. So it was a success as an art film. There were people who, quite rightly, I completely understand, thought that it was indecent. And, I mean, it's one of those things, obviously no one should ever censor art, we say. But, you can see why people were quite horrified, and they were. And people did ask for the film to be banned and things like that. So, yeah, but no, it didn't happen. It didn't happen. People, people respected it, and it has become partly because the reputation of the two people who made it has endured. I think there was one rich couple who saw it so much, because this was funded by one of the filmmaker's mothers, liked it so much that they funded L'Âge d'Or. So there were some influential people who said, this is a film that's so important, I want to make another one. So, we can't really get better than that. I mean, there are urban legends that people have miscarried while watching this film, which are not funny, but just isn't that interesting? Because people always say that about new horror films that come out, that people fainted and threw up, and just think how long that story has been going around.
Well, I love it. Well, it goes all the way back, I suppose. I guess the train coming into the station, right? It's like cinema has, for as long as cinema's been around, there's been stories of this kind of stuff, of people like, gasping and falling out of their seats. Yeah.
It's always someone over there, did it? Someone not as sophisticated as me, because really, genuinely, if a film just induced you to throw up or have fits or, God, I mean, terrible, miscarry a baby, no one should show it ever. Like, that would be terrible. So it's always a bit like, some more foolish people will be taken in by this. I mean, every time a good horror film comes out, people say it's the scariest thing ever, and you think, well, in that case, no one will watch it.
I know. I think I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure Mark Kermode in his book, one of his books, he wrote about how it made him faint. The eye moment in Chien Andalou, it made him faint when he first saw it. So there you go. It's
turns out he's squeamish.
It turns out he's squeamish. No one, no matter how hardcore they think they are, it's gonna get you, this film.
And I watched The Exorcist because of him.
Yeah.
So hard. He's just encouraging us all to toughen up, I think, by recommending all these other great horror films.
That's it. That's so true. Would you, again, I usually end most conversations with kind of what's your would you recommend this film to people who haven't yet seen it? I'm guessing you would, right? Because it feels like such an important film that everyone should see.
It's less than 20 minutes of your life and you'll explode what your idea of cinema is. I think that what they're saying about how cinema can be reimagined can still seem radical, can still seem revolutionary. How few films do you watch that are as brazen about breaking all conventions as this? I remember going to a screening of French silent films with my partner, and I said, one of the films they're going to show is this film. And now he's much better with gore than me, but I did this whole thing of warning him. And he wasn't terrified in the slightest. He wasn't disturbed at all. Not everyone finds it upsetting. I'd recommend it. I think if you want to understand how film has always been reinventing itself and 100 years ago was still feeling fresh and new and revolutionary, you have to watch things like this. Anyone who assumes that the last thing that came out is the only film that's ever had big ideas, the only film that could be called radical, that if it's not from your lifetime, it must be old hat, must see a film like this just to challenge that one little idea. We all have wrong ideas. I probably have so many, but that's something that we need to be careful of.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Brilliant. Pamela, thank you so much for this. I'm going to end the way I always end with all of my new guests, which is to ask you, what's your favourite horror movie?
We've mentioned so many, and yet I think I have to always go back to the original Nosferatu, which also isn't a horror film. It's basically a romance that just has a real bad guy in it. It's a beautiful film. Every time I think that I'm over it, I watch it again and fall in love. It's a beautiful film. It's pre-horror, but yeah, you can't beat that.
Oh, perfect. What a great choice. And then by the sounds of it, you are somebody who finds a lot of movies scary, but could you name what your scariest horror movie experience has ever been?
My scariest horror movie experience? I'm going to tell you my creepiest, because we mentioned Eraserhead. It made me think of it. The day I watched Eraserhead, the night before I'd been out to a gig and I'd been caught in a crush getting out of the gig. And so when I watched Eraserhead the next afternoon, I watched it with a plaster cast slowly hardening around my swollen arm where I'd broken it.
Oh, God.
Is one of the creepiest feelings I've ever had. I subsequently watched the film. It turns out it's still really creepy, but I wouldn't recommend doing it like that.
Oh my God. Yeah, that's not what you need. You don't need extra kind of stimulus kind of affecting your mind and body when you're watching Eraserhead. That's incredible. Pamela, thank you so much for joining me. If people want to come and find you out there, find your website and that kind of thing, where can they find it?
My silent cinema website is silentlondon.co.uk. And it's got lots of stuff about silent film, not just to do with London. And you can probably click around from there and find everything else I get up to. Amazing. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure. A big thank you there to the wonderful Pamela Hutchinson. Such a treat to have her on the podcast. Pamela, if you're listening, please come back again. I know you're not the biggest horror fan, but I would love to have you back. So what are your thoughts on Un Chien Andalou? I would love to hear what you make of this bonkers movie. Please do get in touch, evolutionofhorror@gmail.com.
I'd seen High Tension shortly after it came out, probably 2004, 2005. And I think the twist ending kind of threw me a bit. And I always just kind of put that movie to the side a little bit. And then I got recommended the movie Martyrs, in 2010 or 2011, and I put it on, and it was like, I kind of remember my life before Martyrs. Yes. And then I think of my life after Martyrs. That was a little snippet you just heard there from a very, very exciting interview. I got to sit down and chat to Alex West. She is the co-host of one of my favourite podcasts in the world, The Faculty of Horror. As well as co-hosting that podcast, she also has written a fascinating book called Films of the New French Extremity. This is a topic that we are going to be delving into later on in this series when we
we cover movies like Martyrs, Irreversible, and Inside. So, as literally the person who wrote the book on this movement in horror, I sat down and picked her brains about all things new French extremity. Now, that chat will go out on the main podcast later on in this series. It probably won't be for a few months by the time we get to the horror films of the 21st century, but patrons have exclusive access to that full unedited interview as of now. If you're a $5 or $10 patron, you will get access to that full discussion with Alex West. Simply head on over to patreon.com/evolutionofhorror and tune in now. Meanwhile, for the $10 patrons, our Twin Peaks mini-series discussion will also continue this week. Me and Rob Watts will be discussing the pilot episode of Twin Peaks in spoilerific detail. If you want to have access to this and a whole bunch of other bonus content, then you simply need to sign up now. Patreon.com/evolutionofhorror. And if you donate $5 or $10 per month, you will get access to a whole bunch of bonus content, and you'll get sent an Evolution of Horror sticker, and you'll get a very special thank you on the main podcast. Speaking of, I'm going to give everybody who signed up to Patreon in May a very special thank you. So here it comes. A big thank you to Sarah Dixon, Alan Gardner, Nico Carlos Duarte, Julia Brown, Flex Toomey, Max Helveston, Marilyn McGregor, Paddy Hanna, The Blue Room, Alison Cunningham, W.D. Nichols, Benny Poole, Ewan Martin, Paul Oxbury, Mark Langford, Travis Trudel, Gareth Richards, Riley McLennan, Dan O'Brien, Catherine Whittemeyer, Bad Witches, Richard Stokes, Stefan Drott Trower, Jules Boyle, Lorna Campbell, Bradley Andrew, Paul Young, Grace Kerr, and Matt Quinn. A huge thank you to all of those people. And one more time, if you want to sign up and get treated to weekly bonus content as well as a whole bunch of other treats, then get involved. Patreon.com/evolutionofhorror. That's patreon.com/evolutionofhorror. Okay, now as we move into the second half of this week's episode, we've got a very special treat for you. For those of you who have listened to the previous seasons of this podcast, you'll know that Mary Wilde is one of my most frequent contributors. She is not only an incredible cinephile, but she also is a Freudian and psychoanalytic scholar, and she brings a unique Freudian and psychoanalytic perspective to horror cinema. She runs lots of courses, and she also hosts her own podcast called The Projections Podcast. Now, she always comes on at least once every season to talk about her own unique Freudian perspective about whatever that subgenre might be. But this time I was thinking, how am I going to do this with Mary? Because pretty much the entire series here is filled with movies that I want to hear Mary's perspective on. So, for the very first time on the Evolution of Horror, I am going to have a kind of frequent collaborator across the series. So, as well as my main conversation with different guests each week, we will also hear a little 5-minute segment from Mary, who will lend her own thoughts to that week's films. I need to come up with a name for that little feature. You know, what can I call it? Somebody think of something, you know, like psychoanalytic corner or a 5-minute Freudian break. I don't know. I'm really bad at this kind of thing. Send in your suggestions. Anyway, throughout the rest of the season, we will hear little 5-minute segments from Mary. But this week, I have a little introductory chat with Mary. We sat down and we chatted about her own love for this particular area of horror cinema and why the mind and the body as concepts work so well to create some of the most iconic horror movies in history. So here is my chat with the brilliant Mary Wilde. Mary Wilde, hello.
Hey, Mike. How are you?
Yeah, so good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing okay. Thank you. All things considered, you know, with the lockdown and everything, but I'm bearing up.
I know. Are you keeping yourself busy? Are you watching lots of movies at the moment?
I am. I found that this has been a really good time to catch up on some things that I had been on my watch list for ages and things that I had really been neglecting, but also just kind of conduct new research and revisit old favorites and classics.
Yeah, so you've got you're managing to still do your courses and you're doing them online, right? Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, luckily the Freud Museum have been able to adapt during this lockdown to offering courses via Zoom. And so we've just been continuing. And in fact, fact, I've managed to add even more content to their events program. And yeah, it's been really exciting. I recently taught once again one of my favorite topics on David Lynch, which I know is very apposite for Series 6 for you.
Oh, that is very exciting and a good segue into our conversation. Perfect. So yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because I think all of the times we've talked in the past, we've been talking about things like monster movies and ghost movies and slashers, and you often talk about the kind of psychoanalytic sort of subtext, or this Freudian subtext. But I suppose what's interesting this series is that this time it's kind of text, I mean, rather than subtext, because these films are, for the majority of them, specifically about the horrors from within us, I suppose, our own minds, our own bodies, our own psyches. Let me just start off by asking you your own personal opinion on these types of movies. Are you a fan of psychological horror and body horror?
Oh, absolutely. I would say for me, I find it very difficult to actually separate them. I feel like they really occupy the same textural space for me cinematically. And this kind of dual system of the mind and body represented in horror cinema is my absolute favorite subgenre. It really is. Like, I can't get enough of it. Probably because I am kind of drawn to the more psychological, experiential element in general, anyway, as a topic. So to see it represented in film, it's just my all-time fave.
Ah, perfect. Well, that's wonderful. So let me tell you. I mean, I guess what's quite interesting is that in the early half of the 20th century, Freud was obviously around and working at this time, wasn't he, in sort of early cinema? And I just wondered, how much of an impact did that have? Because you can see when you look at a lot of horror cinema, particularly in the 50s and into the 60s, there are a lot of films about madness and hysteria and these kind of things. Do you think that this growing popularity in psychoanalysis as a subject was influencing horror cinema at that time?
Without a shadow of a doubt, absolutely. I mean, filmmakers right from the start were very fascinated by psychology anyway, but also specifically psychoanalysis and what Freud had to say. His writings became very, very popular among artists, surrealists, Dadaists, and a lot of experimental filmmakers who were working in the horror genre. So to take a very popular example, Alfred Hitchcock, he was very, very well versed in Freud. Like, he read Freud very regularly, and he consciously and intentionally tried to depict the ideas that he learned in psychoanalysis onto film because he found it really compelling. And of course, they absolutely are present when we watch a horror movie like Psycho, and like the Oedipal complex, yes. And also The Birds, and then there are other filmmakers like David Cronenberg who also very consciously understood Freud and very intentionally depicted those ideas in film. So he was hugely influential. In fact, I might even just tell you at this point that when Freud was alive, there were a lot of people who were trying to convince him to contribute to the film industry. Like, they sent him scripts to review and consult on, and they were even making a film about him called Secrets of the Soul. But he actually, there were a lot of requests of that nature, but because he was a very socially conservative man, he was even though he was revolutionary in terms of philosophy and psychology, as a person, he was quite serious. He was a doctor, and he was very image conscious. He didn't want people to overly associate him with the freaks of the surrealist movement, he wanted to be taken seriously always as a physician, as a doctor, and as a scientist. So he was more reluctant to participate in that regard. But nevertheless, so many filmmakers, artists, painters, and so many creative people just adored and admired him. And also people like David Lynch, who say that they've never encountered Freud, they've never really read the texts, but nevertheless, those ideas materialize in their work. And I think this speaks to the authenticity of the theory and how valid and robust it really is.
It's interesting, actually. We've just been talking this week about the film Un Chien Andalou from the 1920s, which is the Salvador Dali, Louis Buñuel sort of surrealist film. I don't know if you're familiar with that film, are you?
Oh, I am.
I mean,
the famous eyeball scene.
Oh my God, amazing. There's definitely something that feels very Freudian about that movie, right? And it's a real interesting mix of mind and body because it's about dreams. It was based on Buñuel and Dali, having dreams and putting them on film. But there's also so much body horror in that. There's the eyeball, of course, and there's sort of ants crawling out of hands, and there's lots of bugs and imagery like that. I feel like there's definitely a lot of Freudian influences on that film.
Without a doubt, absolutely. Like it's the capacity of psychoanalysis and Freud giving all of us a license to engage with our own psyches and actually like encounter the seemingly illogical language of our dreams and then transfer those onto film. I mean, this really empowers filmmakers as, radical as Buñuel and Dali.
Yes, definitely. And it's interesting, I think like I mentioned, there was definitely a growing trend of sort of psychological horror. And I think there became an increasing interest in serial killers throughout the 20th century as well. I mean, obviously Psycho is a really interesting movie in so many ways, and I think it was probably partly influenced by the true crime story of Ed Gein, of course, who influenced so many horror characters. And then going forward, what do you think it is with our fascination about serial killers and the kind of, I suppose, exploring the mind of a serial killer in films and in true crime?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. I mean, to me, I look at the serial killer represented in film. Now, whether that's a documentary or like a fictionalized title like The House That Jack Built, that to me represents the excess violence that a human being is capable of. And so in a way, that symbol is very compelling because through the archetype, we can explore our own secret impulses for violence that would otherwise be unacceptable to admit to in polite society. So in a way, like this harks to something that Freud talked about, a term called sublimation. And this is actually a psychological process whereby it's the socially acceptable way to express something taboo and like do it in a way that doesn't harm anybody. It's just kind of like just a catharsis or a release. And maybe like the popularity of, serial killer movies, but also true crime documentaries speaks to the streak and impulse in all of us to like really engage with that excess of violence, but without actually harming anybody. Like I would argue that a lot of people say that we should ban violence in movies, but of course, no research has ever shown that watching violent films makes you inherently violent. I would actually argue the reverse. I would argue that banning and repressing extreme violence probably causes us to search for a less sublimated outlet to commit really atrocious acts. So in some really paradoxical way, I think it's healthy to watch serial killers.
Yeah, I think you're so right. And I suppose, isn't that true of the whole horror genre as well, isn't it? That kind of experiencing the horrors and the violence of real life, but in a safe space, I suppose, as a kind of catharsis. Yeah, it's fascinating. And then, interestingly, we talked about this a bit last week, but the idea of serial killers and psychological thrillers dealing with serial killers are often quite male skewed. And then a lot of the kind of female psychological thrillers, female led, tend to be a little bit more about madness or hysteria, especially a lot of those movies from the 60s and 70s by filmmakers like Polanski, etc. Again, what do you think was the reason behind that kind of trend, this idea of gaslighting or of this kind of hysterical woman in horror cinema?
Well, firstly, I really agree with your statement about the gendered aspect of serial killers, how it's kind of in a way more digestible to see a male serial killer. Like it's not too much of a departure from the license that men are given to express violence, like bodily and psychologically. But it's very interesting, the depiction of women and the kind of, I guess, representation of psychopathology in horror cinema that is afforded to women. I think you are right. Predominantly, it does seem to center around gaslighting, denying the female experience, telling her that her reality is not the shared reality, like there's something wrong with her. And I think that this derives out of despite the progress that we've made, that there still exist standards and stereotypes about women that pervade mainstream consciousness, that women are expected to be delicate, nurturing, maternal, soft, non-threatening, sweet, etc. And so if there's any kind of disturbance at a psychological or even physical level in the woman, if she doesn't quite align herself with these like expectations, then that reality not matching up creates a state where her very subjectivity is denied, and then she is gaslit as a human being. Like, she's not allowed to exist in a discourse that doesn't exactly, follow those prescriptions of how she's supposed to be. So therein, in the capacity for madness in women, exists such a pervading discourse of gaslighting. And this is, in a way, what these movies are telling us is that the complicated, like multidimensional, imperfect representation of female subjectivity is somehow scarier, and that men being violent or something, like because women are expected to abide by very different expectations. And the horror genre creates a space that allows us to process and like pick apart those messy feelings in relation to that.
Kevin Lyons said something really interesting on the podcast last week, actually. He said, in some ways, even a film like Repulsion, you could see as a kind of gaslighting film. She's almost being gaslit by society, for being driven mad by sex or having sexual feelings or whatever, just because of that's the kind of role, or that's the world that women were living in at the time, I suppose, which is quite interesting.
Wow, that is so interesting. I totally agree.
It's really interesting as well, ever since even Chien Andalou, maybe even going back before that to movies like Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, filmmakers have tried to visualize kind of internal space, inner space, I suppose. So psychological states being put on screen. Do you think that's an effective, is film an effective way of visualizing our subconscious, our dreams, all those things that are really virtually impossible for us to get our heads around, really, in a kind of logical way? Do you think films are able to kind of do that successfully?
Yeah, I do. And I think that's the beauty of cinema, is that innovations always follow those desires to approximate psychological states, so that, like I'm thinking now of particularly people like Darren Aronofsky and Gaspar Noé. Like, they really try and replicate the internal landscape of their characters by using very unusual camera techniques and inventing a very unique style of filmmaking that tries to capture what that inner space is like. And not only do they try to depict it, but they very aggressively like push us onto the point of view of the character by forcing us to occupy a very disturbed space and not letting us out. Like, there's no let up, it just continues to escalate and escalate. And to me, that is a very exciting and effective methodology from a horror perspective, because it does really show us what the internal life is like. It's no longer just these external monsters like ghosts and zombies and vampires and, this external threat that's shown to be externalized as a fear object. What's really frightening is, something within ourselves, whether it's our mind or our body. There's no option to run away from those monsters, because we are the fear source at that point. The ultimate terror, because there's nowhere to hide. We're stuck with ourselves.
And you're so right about those two directors. I mean, they're two of the only filmmakers I can think of that have made me feel sort of physically nauseous watching their films in cinemas. Gaspar Noé with his insane kind of camera work where he flips it upside down and it kind of floats into the atmosphere and it kind of, irreversible and into the void and climax. These movies are, again, I think it's a very easy trope that a lot of filmmakers try and do, of kind of quote unquote drug movies where they make everything look a bit wacky and weird, but Gaspar Noé does it so successfully, and so does Aronofsky as well in movies like Requiem for a Dream. You do feel that kind of that fear and panic and disorientation, I think, that the characters are experiencing.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Like, I'm thinking especially of Mother. Like, that is such a panic disorder movie. Like, someone who the house represents, let's say, their body, and she's kind of like roaming around it. At first, she's seen as peaceful, and then all these people start barging in, and more people start to invade, and that really does kind of mimic how panic disorder transpires. The subject is being invaded by fear, and it's constant anxiety and constant fear.
Yes, exactly. And there's that feeling of claustrophobia Darren Aronofsky creates really well, doesn't he? In Mother, we are completely trapped in. It's absolutely unbearable, isn't it? And Requiem for a Dream as well. He kind of pioneered that sort of camera movement where he would almost strap the camera to his actors, and we would just be stuck in that little sort of bubble with them, weren't we? As they kind of were living through this hell, and you can't escape it. It's quite powerful.
It's very powerful. Yeah. And it really binds the viewer to the character psychologically. Like, we really are able to identify with what that person is going through emotionally.
Yeah. And I find it very interesting, the different ways across cinema history that different filmmakers have tried to, put us in the minds of people, I suppose. It's a very difficult thing to pull off. And actually, let's talk about David Lynch, because again, I think nobody more successfully, in my opinion, achieves the idea of putting across kind of subconscious filmmaking, films that hit me on a kind of real emotional level, and I don't even know why sometimes. Everyone often says, don't they, that David Lynch's films are pure mood, and what an incredible thing to pull off, that sometimes they defy logic but they can still make you feel something more than most other movies.
Yeah, he's extraordinary. Like, with everything that he takes on, the fact that his process is also rooted in his background in painting. Like, he's a true artist. He went to art school in Philadelphia, and he said that the mood of that city when he was living there, it was a very different city to how it is now. At that point in the late 60s, early 70s, Philadelphia was a very dangerous place. There was a lot of crime, and his own house that he shared with his partner got burgled while they were in the house several times. He unexpectedly became a father at that time, and he always says that the mood that he found in Philadelphia, that of danger, of worry about his baby, and coming from like a very sort of like seemed to be very square kind of background in the Midwest, his father being a tree surgeon, and him growing up as a kid in a suburb and being around woods and very kind of wholesome, to suddenly enter this really dark space. He's always said that Philadelphia is one of his biggest influences, and he likes, as an artist, to encounter what seems to be like a nightmare scenario.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess you only have to take one look at Eraserhead, don't you, to see that everything you just said there, the panic about becoming a father, about living in this kind of sparse, quite scary industrial location, and then the way he does kind of, it's interesting that his father was a tree surgeon, because you also get this idea that sometimes he views those kind of rural spaces as these kind of utopias or something in comparison to these nightmarish cityscapes. It's one of my favorite stories is I've heard David Lynch on an interview talk about how he became a filmmaker, and like you said, he was a painter, and I love the way he tells stories, and he was like, there was a painting, and the light was coming in through the window, and the painting started to move,
and from the painting I heard a wind, and the green started moving, and I thought, oh, a moving painting, but with sound. And that idea stuck in my head. A moving painting.
Wow. Yeah, I love that. Mel Brooks calls him Jimmy Stewart from Mars. Isn't that wonderful?
Amazing. Absolutely amazing. So are you personally a fan of Lynch and Lynch's work?
I'm a mega fan. Like, I cut my cinematic teeth on Lost Highway.
And I don't understand people that say that isn't a horror movie, because Lost Highway is pure horror to me.
It really is. And actually, for those who are looking to do more of a drill down into Lost Highway, Slavoj Žižek really provides a really interesting theory around why Lost Highway feels so terrifying. And it's because he talks about how, like, the whole world of Lost Highway feels like it's just purely occupying a space between reality and fantasy, but we're just trapped there. Like, it doesn't move, and we never know what's real or what's dream or nightmare. We're constantly questioning, and that in itself is terrifying.
It is. It's something about psychological horror, I think, should be disorientating in that way, where you almost don't trust anything you're watching, I suppose, and that's the feeling you get with Lost Highway, isn't it? Definitely. There's no safety net of kind of conventional narratives or framing devices. It's horrible. And then on the flip side to that, we have David Cronenberg, who you've mentioned. I mean, don't you think, Mary, wouldn't Freud have been a big fan of Cronenberg's work?
Yes, absolutely. I'm willing to bet if Freud was alive today, he would be president of the David Cronenberg fan club. like the Vienna division,
Yes.
It's in a way, it is fascinating to think about Cronenberg because he is so well-versed in Freud. Of course, he actually even made a biopic, The Dangerous Method, kind of examining the relationship between Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung and their colleague Sabine Spielrein. And I think the reason why, I'm willing to kind of guess that the reason why Cronenberg is more of a body horror filmmaker is probably because he is a more faithful Freudian in that regard. Because in Freud, the theory always comes back and is grounded in the physiology. For Freud, he believed that biology is destiny. He always tried to return to symptomology being written on the body. Remember, he was a neurologist.
Yes.
And so for him, the physiology is very important, but not just that, it's the kind of abject representation, the psychopathology when things go wrong in our mind, and the psychosomatic representation of them being written on the body as neurotic symptoms or psychosomatic symptoms. And this to me is like really beautifully executed in Cronenberg because he is a real master at translating the problems of the mind onto the body.
Do you have a favorite Cronenberg film?
Oh, it's hard to pick just one. I would have to say Crash, just because I feel like it's the most interesting in terms of like erotic cinema and the scary aspects, like the horrifying aspect of sexuality. But I also do really enjoy Dead Ringers.
Oh, I love Dead Ringers as well. Yeah, those kind of 90s ones, Crash and Dead Ringers, were the sort of in-between period, aren't they, in his career, because he had all of those much more traditional horror films in his early career, and then he's doing something very different these days with movies like A Dangerous Method and Cosmopolis and Maps to the Stars. And those movies he made in the 90s were sort of almost feel transitional, don't they, in some way?
Yeah, they do, absolutely. And I have to say, I'm a huge fan, not just because of his style, but also he's a fellow Canadian like me.
Oh, of course. I mean, Canada, they do some of the best movies in the horror genre, I think, don't they?
Yeah.
They've got a great tradition of horror.
And it's exciting to see that that David Cronenberg's son, Brandon, is kind of following in his dad's footsteps in terms of his approach to horror filmmaking as well.
Oh, wow. I mean, his new film, Mary, as soon as it's out, you must watch it because you will love it. It's called Possessor, and it's just wonderful. Probably the best film I've seen this year. Yeah.
Wow. I can't wait because I loved Antiviral.
Yes. Oh, it's so good. It's so good. I'm so glad that he's following in his footsteps. It's great. Yeah. So, I mean, and there's all these little interesting kind of niche areas that we're covering in this series. And I suppose all of these culminate in, we're going to be looking at what happens when movies push these kind of psychological and body horrors to their extreme. And we're going to be looking at, I suppose, a kind of subgenre that people call extreme cinema. Whether it's, Cannibal Holocaust or Martyrs or, like we mentioned, Irreversible. What are your thoughts on these types of movies? They're very difficult for a lot of people to stomach and to sit through. How are you when it comes to extreme cinema?
I don't know. Like it seems paradoxical to say that scare me because I am so easy to startle. Like my husband could tell you that living with me, like he's constantly like, jumping out and like scaring me. But he's very, very playful fellow. But it's so strange because actually when I watch extreme horror cinema like Martyrs or the wonderful French film Dans ma peau, In My Skin by Marina de Vanne.
Oh God, yeah.
Anything to do with like cannibalism and anything like overly gory, it doesn't really bother me. But I do have a theory about why like they're so popular and like why they're so compelling anyway, even if it grosses people out. And I think that there's a psychoanalytic explanation because extreme horror, in the same way that any form of excess has a certain appeal, like eating too many bonbons or like, binge drinking or partying, like whenever there's like an overindulging in sensory stimuli, it can create an impression in the viewer that we are grounded in the present moment. There's no escape route. Like we're just kind of like immersed and submerged in something that is kind of larger than life. And that is something that the cinema is uniquely able to create, the showing of content that really pushes the boundaries of comfort. And then we can really get lost in the overabundance of what we're seeing. And the fear factor really grounds us even more in our own body. So there is no possibility of evading it. Like it's really attention grabbing, and that's how I like to explain extreme cinema. And like there's also this kind of myth building around extreme horror. Like, there's like urban legends about, movies that are too disgusting and like they're kind of passed around and, and we feel kind of in a way motivated to watch them. I'm thinking for myself, like I've always wanted to see August Underground, but I still haven't had the courage to watch it.
Oh God, I know. I haven't sat down to watch that yet either. I've watched some of the most notorious ones, like the more mainstream ones, if you even can call them that. But a Serbian film I've sat through, and a Cannibal Holocaust I've sat through, and they are all. That's it. Is that there's something to do with that morbid curiosity, isn't there? Like you said, like I kind of want to experience them at least just once. Sallow as well. Oh God.
Yeah, exactly. It's like going to like the fairground and being dared to go on the scariest ride, like like it's kind of something to kind of look forward to, even as you kind of as a cinephile, as a horror film kind of story, you're like covering all the basics, all the classics. Then there's that little corner, that edge, and it kind of in a way overlaps the fear from the screen to your real life, where you're like daring yourself to go into that house that everyone's like warning you not to go into. It's kind of like a fun, immersive experience.
Definitely. Yeah, I agree. And then there's one filmmaker who I guess really sits interestingly kind of in the middle of the Venn diagram there between sort of extreme cinema, provocative cinema, horror cinema, psychological movie making. Lars Von Trier. Now I know you're a big Lars fan, right?
Oh yeah, I'm a diehard Lars head, Mike. I love him to bits.
Now, I personally, I love some of his movies, and other ones make me really angry. But do you think that's part of the design of Lars films? Do you think they're meant to make us angry and uncomfortable?
I do. I really do. Like, I really feel like Lars von Trier, he sort of earned his stripes as a horror filmmaker by directing a classic, Antichrist, of course, which sits very neatly in the realm of body horror.
Yeah.
So even though he doesn't traditionally make horror films, like he did make that one, and he kind of is a qualified filmmaker in horror in the same way that Kubrick was with The Shining, and he also visited other genres, of course. But I feel like more generally, Lars von Trier is a masterful horror cinema, but in the abstract, because he's a provocateur. Like he's constantly pushing us. He's constantly trying to disturb and pull us out of our comfort zone, and consciously pushing our buttons in a way that is more controversial, even sometimes, than extreme horror filmmakers. You know, they make us question our basic values and morals that we've long held on to. And in some way, we start to resent aspects of ourselves and become angry, maybe for identifying with a character or for becoming offended or whatever it may be. You know, there's like a list of things that he plays around with, different factors. But ultimately, I think for people who like to hate Lars, it's just easier to like choose him as a, you know, kind of like identify him as a scapegoat for provoking than it would be to admit that our own worldview may be fallible. I mean, I've been, he's affected me in that way. I've had to like question myself. Like, he's a very philosophically horrific filmmaker in that regard.
That's right. You're so right. I think sometimes it is easier to get angry at Lars Von Trier for suggesting some of these horrific things that he suggests in his films, rather than reckon with ourselves that maybe part of us might sympathise with that or agree with whatever that might be he's conveying on screen. Yeah. It's very true. Such a fascinating kind of collection of filmmakers and genres that we're looking at here. And I kind of thought, Mary, I was like, before I spoke to you, when I was putting together this series, I thought these are pretty much all of Mary's favourite filmmakers and movies, right? From Lynch to Cronenberg to Gaspar Noé to Aronofsky to Lars. These are your faves.
These are my all-time faves. It's as if you peeked inside my mind.
the psychological horror that is Mary's brain.
Exactly.
Well, this is it, and that's why I'm very excited, because you're going to be kind of coming on this journey with me over the next few months, aren't you? So we're going to be hearing more from Mary, and you're going to be sort of contributing some of your thoughts sort of on several of the big films that we're going to be covering for the rest of the series, which is going to be so much fun.
Yeah, I'm so excited and absolutely honored to be able to contribute in this way and share little bits of, you know, my impression and associations and evaluations of films that you're covering in Series 6. Certainly a lot of the films that you've programmed, I have covered in my courses in the past. So I look forward to sharing my ideas with you guys.
Oh, so exciting. I can't wait. So my final question for you then is, you know, for anyone out there maybe who's a bit new to this area of horror cinema, where would you suggest they start? I mean, what's a great kind of quintessential film, in your opinion, that kind of really sums up the horror of the mind and the body all in one?
I would have to say Black Swan by Darren Aronofsky.
Ooh, good choice.
Yeah, just because I feel like it really strikes a good balance between, as you say, body horror and the horrors of the mind. But also it's really beautiful to look at because it's kind of in the world of the ballet, and it is kind of reinventing and reimagining what it's like as a dancer in that world and the anxieties and psychoses that go along with that. And the last 15 minutes of Black Swan, in my opinion, are some of the best in all of cinema history. I mean, it's so stunning. So definitely, if you've not seen Black Swan, make sure you see it.
Yeah, I was absolutely knocked out by that film when I first saw it. I thought it was just wonderful, perfect film.
Yeah.
And I love that it manages to capture the kind of the beauty and elegance of ballet, but also the body horror of ballet, right? I mean, what those ballet dancers put their own bodies through, and they really don't shy away from all of that side of it as well, which I loved.
Yeah, the hangnail.
Oh, the hangnail. Horrific. Absolutely horrific. Amazing. Well, we'll leave it there because we'll hear more from you on all of these movies going forward. But thank you so much for joining me, Mary, for this. This has been so much fun as a little introduction chat.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
If people do want to kind of seek out more of your work and come and join some of your courses online, where can they find details?
The best place is to look at my Twitter. So that's Psychstar, PSYCSTAR. And I announce upcoming events and share the odd meme or whatever, like lots of fun. And I also have a link on there to the podcast that I co-host with Sarah Cleaver, Projections Podcast.
Yes. What are you guys up to at the moment on that? Are you have you got another series on the go at the moment?
We do. We have season 4 currently. We're looking at films that depict the world of work and money. So like kind of economics in cinema.
Oh God, that sounds frightening.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, Mary, thank you so much for joining me.
Pleasure. Thanks, Mike.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and a huge thank you to my two guests, Pamela Hutchinson and, of course, the brilliant Mary Wilde. And as we mentioned, we'll be hearing much more from Mary throughout the rest of the series. Cannot wait. So, what did you think of this week's episode? I would love to hear your thoughts. Please do get in touch. The email address is evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. Don't forget, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. I love hearing from you guys on social media, and I love hearing from you in the discussion group. Come and join our discussion group and chat to me and fellow listeners about horror movies. That's the Evolution of Horror discussion group, and that can be found on Facebook. You can find all previous episodes and seasons of this podcast on our website. Simply head over to evolutionofhorror.com. You can find this podcast on all major podcast platforms, including iTunes, Podbean, Stitcher, Acast, and Spotify. Please subscribe to us. Please spread the word, spread the love. And if you want to support this podcast, I would really appreciate a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps us get discovered by new listeners. So, on to next week then. Next week is going to be our first double bill of feature film discussions. One iconic early psychological horror and one iconic early body horror. Next week, I'm going to be joined by the brilliant, the incomparable James Swanton, and we are going to be discussing The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari from 1920 and Todd Browning's Freaks from 1932. What a pair. Join us next week for all of this and more on the Evolution of Horror.